Where she now lives, and I don't want to say a lot about. I mean, I had a couple of personal things I'd like to mention. She reminded me that I don't believe this, but in 1957, I played piano on an album she was doing in England with an English singer called Ronnie Carroll. My past is coming back to haunt me, and we've been. I guess I worked for Angela in those days, but we became friends, and she's worked with me over the years in, I think it was the mid-'70s. And when Julie Andrews was about to play the Palladium, and Angela came aboard, and one little interesting thing she said on the, because of another name who was associated with us both was Herbie Spencer. They worked together on Jesus Christ Superstar with Andre Previn. But evidently on this album that I was playing on in 1957, Angela said Herbie was in the booth. He just appeared, and a little later they did a movie together. It was earlier. Oh my God. So our paths go back a long way. And it's really an honor and a privilege to have her here today to talk to us. Ladies and gentlemen, Angela Morley.
Oh, gosh.
We're presenting this. We normally don't honor our speakers, but as Angela has come all the way from Arizona today, we thought it would be nice that we're also, apart from being our speaker, we're honoring our own. So we're presenting Angela with the plaque which honors our arrangers.
Thank you very much. Would you mind taking something like that? Good afternoon. I would like to begin by saying two things. First of all, I would like to thank ASMAC for inviting me here today to be your guest and to accord to me the high privilege of talking to you for a while. Secondly, I'd like to say that this couldn't have happened at a more appropriate time, because this month of May 1999 is the 60th anniversary of the day in May 1939 when I left home at the age of 15 and went on the road playing in a band, playing saxophone and clarinet. So, and I've been getting away with it for the last 60 years. Well, I was born in a town called Leeds, Leeds, which was and still is the industrial capital of England's largest county, Yorkshire. And my parents had a jeweler's shop, and my mother looked after the customers, and my father sat at a bench from 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening with his apprentice, Frank, and they repaired watches, and they made rings bigger and smaller. And this room that he worked in was also our family room, because we had all our meals in it, and it was always our bathroom as well, because for baths we'd bring out a big zinc tub and put it in front of the fire, and that's how we'd have baths.
Excuse me.
Yes.
They're asking you to speak a little bit louder.
A little bit louder, well, therefore nearer to the microphone. Okay. They also had, my father, I'm thinking about musical influences in the family, there really weren't any. My father played the ukulele banjo on a Sunday evening, and my mother fancied herself as a contralto. But what they did have, they had one of those magnificent old-fashioned gramophones that you wound up, and it was in a big mahogany cabinet, and it was very imposing. It stood at the bottom of the stairs, and in the cupboard underneath it they had a lot of records, and these records were all of English dance bands of the late 1920s. 1928, 29, maybe 1930, and they used to let me play with these records. And I used to wind up the gramophone with a handle. When I first started, I could hardly reach the handle. And then and I'd have to go up about 3 steps of the stairs to be high enough to lift up the lid. And I put these records on. I used to play these dance band records. And one of them still exists today. I still have it. And it's of a song called Let's Put Out the Lights and Go to Sleep. And when I was 8, they decided that I might be a little musical, so they sent me for piano lessons. And after only 3 months of piano lessons, we had a family catastrophe. My father died of angina at the age of 39, and the piano lessons were suspended, and they were just forgotten about. Nobody thought to recommence them, and that 3 months at the piano is the only piano education I've had all my life. Although much later on I did make myself practice Haydn sonatas and things like that, try and learn to play the piano a bit, but I'll never be a pianist like Ian, you know, an arranger's pianist. My mother kept the business going for about a year. She couldn't handle it. She sold it. She moved us in with her parents about 30 miles further south in a mining community. And they had a mom and pop shop, and they sold everything from a jug of beer to a button or a slice of bacon. And they didn't have electricity. We used to have to light the gas when it got dark. They didn't have an inside toilet. They didn't have a telephone. They didn't have a car. So things were very different from the way they had been. I had about a month's relationship with the violin until my grandfather, who was a big prankster, decided it would be fun to put some grease on the bow, and of course then it didn't work, so that was the end of the violin. Then I saw somebody at the local vaudeville theatre, saw somebody play the accordion. I became crazy to have one of those, and they got me a little one, and then a medium-sized one, finally a big one. I had lots of lessons. I won a couple of prizes, and a judge at one of those competitions advised my mother that there was no future in the accordion, and I should learn an instrument I could play in a band, maybe the clarinet, maybe the saxophone. So in a pawnbroker's shop we found a clarinet, and the price was $4, which was £1 in 1937 currency values. And this was the strangest clarinet I've ever seen. Anybody who's had any relationship with a clarinet knows it comes in about 5 bits. There's the bell, there's the lower joint, the upper joint, the barrel and the mouthpiece. Well, the mouthpiece was broken, was useless. There was a barrel, and then the rest of it was in one piece. And it was a simple system, and it was high pitch. But nevertheless, I got a mouthpiece, and I had lessons on it, and I started to learn to play it. And at this time, my mother was having ballroom dancing lessons at the local ballroom, the Empress Rooms it was called. And the teacher was the local semi-pro band leader. So she told him about me, and he said I could go any Saturday afternoon and sit behind the 2 saxes, and they'd give me the second alto book, and I could play all the clarinet bits, which I did. And then, of course, I was dying to have a saxophone. I was bought an alto, and it was silver-plated, and across the bell it said Pennsylvania, and I thought this must be pretty special. Many, many years later I was told it was a cheap Czechoslovakian instrument. So much for the Pennsylvania. So now I was playing the saxophone and the clarinet, and I had a friend at this time who was always telling me about his sister. His sister played in a band that was on the road all the time, and he would tell me stories like one day he said, "You know that band my sister's in? Well, they've just made a film." And I thought, that's pretty romantic. And then one day he came to me and said, "You know that band my sister's in? All next week it's going to be appearing at the Alhambra Theatre, Bradford." Now, Bradford was not very far away, about 30 miles away. And my mother took me I was just about 15 at this time. She took me to see this band, and it was vaudeville, and there were 2 shows a night, and the band closed the show. And as soon as that curtain went up and I saw that band, I knew I was going to be in that band if I had to kill somebody to do it, you know. So we went round to the stage door, and I spoke to the band leader, and he said I should come one morning later in the week, and I could sit in with some of the saxophones and so on. So I did that. Now I must explain what this band was. This band was a juvenile band. This was a band where the ages ranged from 15 to 19, and it was called Archie's Juvenile Band. Now, in England at that time, there were 3 of these juvenile bands going around the vaudeville theatres and cinemas, playing on the lift going up and down, you know. And one was Archie's juvenile band. The other one was called the Royal Kilty Juniors. They wore Scottish kilts. And then there was another one called the Savoy Kilty Juniors. And I'm wondering if Wolfie Phillips was in one of those bands, because Pardon?
Teddy Joyce's juvenile band.
That's right. Well, wasn't that the Savoy Kilty Juniors? That was the Royal Kilty. Yeah, yes, that's right. Okay, so I went home after this audition, not knowing whether I got the job or not. And the weeks went by and I didn't hear anything. And then a big quarrel started in the family. My mother's parents were quarrelling with her because they were saying that she would be crazy to let me do this thing. And my grandfather said, he said that if I became a musician, I would always need my shoes repairing. And my clothes would always be threadbare at the elbows. Fortunately, he lived long enough for me to prove that he'd been very, very wrong. Anyway, one day a postcard came and inviting me to join the band at a theatre in the Birmingham area, with Dudley Hippodrome for my countrymen that might be here, and off I went. As soon as I got there, by the way, I don't know what the money is yet. That hasn't even been discussed. When I got there, I discovered the money was $1.50 a week, and the digs were paid. It was 7 and 6 a year in British currency at that time. And a few weeks later, it did actually go up to $2 because I agreed to do a little accordion thing for 10 minutes. And as soon as I joined the band, they all came around asking me, what is your favourite band? And I thought, well, you know, what's the best band in England? The best band in England at that time was the Ambrose Orchestra. So I said, Ambrose. And they all started laughing. I said, what are you laughing at? They said, haven't you heard any American bands? Haven't you heard Benny Goodman? Haven't you heard Tommy Dorsey? And of course I hadn't. But within 15 minutes we were in one of those record stores that used to exist a long time ago, where you could take records into a little booth and you could play them all afternoon. And that's what we did. And that's where my education started. And so I toured with this band. I said the digs were paid. Well, the digs were pretty rough. In a double bed there would always be 3 people. There were usually 2 double beds in a room. And on certain occasions, maybe I think of one actually, where it was a big room and there were 3 double beds in a room, and therefore 9 people. So I toured with this band throughout the summer of 1939, and then in England the war came on September the 3rd, 1939. All our dates, they closed all the places of entertainment, so all our dates were cancelled. We had weeks of playing in London cinemas, going up and down on the lift. And so we all went home. And when I got home, my mother said, now then, you mustn't be a burden on your grandparents. You must get a job right away. So I took the first job that was advertised, and it was to be a trainee projectionist in a little cinema called the Roxy. And I wasn't very good as a trainee projectionist. I made some very bad mistakes. Now, see, I was always told that if I laced up a film, and it was my job to bring the film in, lace it up on the projector, must always make sure to have them in the right order. And there was one night when in reel 2 a man was shot in the living room, and then in reel 7 somehow I got reel 2 on again. And this man walked in the living room and nobody was surprised to see he was alive, you know, and he was shot again. Well, I got in terrible trouble for that. Then another thing I was always told is, before you start up a projector, you must lift up the side and make sure that the carbon pencils are long enough to get through the reel, you see. And sometimes I forgot to do that. I'd be looking through the little hole at the picture, kind of dreaming, you know, and the screen would start to go darker and darker and darker. Then I'd hear feet on the stairs. It was the first projectionist who'd been sitting with his girlfriend on the back row. He was coming up to salvage the situation. So early in December, when I got a postcard to say that the band was coming together again and would I like to go back, nobody was very sorry at the Roxy Cinema. and off I went. And now the money was $4 a week. Big money now. So I toured with the band again until the spring, and then I thought I'd had enough of being in a juvenile band. And and I was now 16. I was dying to have a job in an adult band. So then that started now my having, during a period of about a year and a half, playing in many, many bands, different bands, always in ballrooms. And the game really was to not be in a band in a city that was being bombed. Now, the first job I had was in Croydon, which is a suburb of London. And when the London Blitz started, I thought, I don't want to be here. And I didn't need to be there. So I got a job somewhere up in the Midlands in a town called Derby. And I played in a ballroom there for a couple of months. And it was while I was there that my accordion playing career came to an end. I saw a man in Air Force uniform who I knew, and he was dancing around with a local girl, and he told me that he and his unit were being shipped out to India the following day. So I called him over and I said, "Did you say you were going to India tomorrow?" He said, "Yes." I said, "How would you like to take an accordion to India with you?" And he said, "Oh, that would be great." I said, "Well, here it is." That was the end of the accordion. So I played in many bands over a period of, as I say, a year and a half. And then I did a summer season at an English coast resort called Blackpool. And we played for a show. We were kind of on the stage playing for this review. And in September, a band came to the local theatre that was very well known in England at the time. You'd never have heard of it. But they played on the radio a great deal, and they made records for Decca. And I did an audition, and I got the job. They were just moving up from 4 saxes to 5, and I got the job on lead alto. So I was in that band for a couple of years. But there's something I forgot to tell you about Archer's Juvenile Band. The pianist, there were 2 very good musicians in the band. There was the trombone player, who Wolfie will know, is a man called Jackie Armstrong, who is one of the first called trombone players in London. And the pianist was a very good pianist. And whenever he wasn't actually sleeping or eating or performing or travelling, he would have his little portable wind-up gramophone out, playing Tommy Dorsey records, but he'd only listen to 2 or 3 bars, then he'd stop it and he'd write something down. So I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm trying to write down this arrangement." So I said, "Well, can I help you?" So I joined him in doing this, and we took down a few Tommy Dorsey arrangements. The curious thing is, we didn't write a score. In fact, I'd never heard the word score, and I didn't hear it for about another year. At that time, we just wrote parts, and they were all over the place, some of them wet, and then we used to play them. Now then, when I'm in this other band now I've just been telling you about, I was on the road with them for 2 years. It was in that band that I really learned how to write band arrangements that worked every time, for which I got paid. So that was good. After 2 years on the road, I decided that was enough. I wanted to be in London, and I left the band, and I just set up in London. I don't think I played very much, except for fun. I would go out late in the evening to nightclubs and sit in and play jazz. But for money, I was just arranging. And then the following summer, which would be about May 1944, I was invited to join what at that time was the best band in England. It was called the Geraldo Orchestra. And it was really a radio band. They did many, many radio shows every week. Very, very rarely went out of London. And I joined that band on second alto and as an arranger. And I was with that band for 4 years. Now, the interesting thing about this band from the point of view of an arranger is that we were a dance band for about 2 of those radio shows a week, and for about the other 5, we would be a concert orchestra. Sometimes we'd be a symphony orchestra. Indeed, we used to play American in Paris and the Piano Concerto in F and some Elgar and some Bizet and all kinds of Massenet, all kinds of things. And of course, I wasn't equipped to arrange for that kind of orchestra, because my vocabulary was strictly for writing for the band, and I don't think I was capable of writing a major chord that didn't have the 6th and the 9th and the major 7th in it as well. So I got the name of somebody who was a very good private teacher, and this was a man called Matthias Scheiber, and he was a Hungarian composer who'd studied with Kodai and had been highly praised by Bartók. Indeed, Bartók had walked out of a jury because they weren't going to give Matthias the first prize. So I studied with Matthias for a while. Now, I remember the first time I went to see him, he said, "Now I know how busy you are writing arrangements." He said, "I must find out what you know before we start." So he said, "Why don't you go to the piano? Why don't you improvise some harmonies or something like that, so I can hear how you're thinking musically?" So I did that. Now then, at that time, I was a very, very big fan of the Stan Kenton band. So what I played that day would be heavily laced with Stan Kenton ideas, I'm pretty sure. And when I finished, there was a silence, and then he said, I think we should start at the beginning. So for the homework that I took home, I had to write out 5/1 and 4/1 cadences in every key, major and minor, with each note of the triad in the top part. Well, that was so mind-bendingly boring that I didn't go back for another lesson. I thought, I can't do this. And then about 3 months later, having given myself a very stern sort of talking to, I went back and I studied them with Mattis for about 4 years, and I wrote a lot of counterpoint exercises for him and all kinds of things. We analysed lots of pieces of music, and I wrote models of things, and of course I learnt an enormous amount. At the same time, I was studying in a conducting class with a German conductor called Walter Gurr. And when, by this time, I now decided to leave the Giraldo Orchestra. But before I tell you what happened after that, I want to tell you about two very big influences that I had when I was at Giraldo. In the latter part of 1944, there were some wonderful things going on in music in London. First of all, there was the US Navy Band, fronted by Sam Donahue, was in town. There was also the American Band of the Allied Expeditionary Force, conducted by Major Glenn Miller. And there was also a Canadian band of the Allied Expeditionary Force. And this was conducted by a man called Captain Robert Farnham. And when Robert Farnham got out of the army, was demobilised, he didn't want to go back to Toronto. He decided to stay in London. And to kind of get his career going, he came and worked for us for about a year and a half. And so he wrote arrangements for that concert orchestra version of the Giraldo Orchestra, and they were absolutely wonderful to play them and to just to hear them. And that was a tremendous influence. And the other influence was just about the time I was leaving the band. Bill Finnegan came over to Paris to study with Nadia Boulanger, and our guitar player found him there and persuaded him to come to London from time to time and write arrangements for us. And he wrote about 16 arrangements for us. Some of them, like thinking particularly of the Continental, he'd previously arranged for Tommy Dorsey. He simply rearranged the parts for us. The Tommy Dorsey version had 5 trumpets with Charlie Shavers. We only had 4, and the saxophone doubles were a little different, but it was essentially the same score. Just 2 or 3 of the things he wrote for us, he later sold to Tommy Dorsey. And so that was fantastic. And those two people, Bob Farn and Bill Finnegan. So anyway, I left the band and I gave up playing at age 26, just to arrange and to hopefully compose film music. And I sort of earned a living doing that. Then, when I was 29, which is 1953, a lot of good things happened to me. One was that I took over the conductorship of a top radio show called The Goon Show. There was a season every year, and it ran throughout the 1950s. So I got that job. That was a very good job to have. I also started getting movies to score under my own name. I'd ghosted a couple of movies the year before. So 1953 I started doing movies. And then one day I received a mysterious phone call. A man phoned me, and he told me his name, and I vaguely recognized who he was. And he said, if you were offered the job as musical director of a big new recording company of an internationally famous name, would you use me as your contractor? So I said, yes. Because, I mean, if I'd said no, I might never hear another word about this thing. So I said yes, thinking, how bad can he be? I mean, and if he was that bad, there'd be some way of getting out of the situation. So about a week later, I was asked by some people to come and see them, and it turned out to be Philips, who were going to start up in London as a recording company. And so I worked at Philips for many years and made many, many singles and albums and with various people. And I think Ian told you that one album that we both worked on together. And also did some instrumental albums, and I did a Christmas album that was released here on Warner Brothers Records, 1959, and the year before I'd done a London album that was released on Columbia Records. In fact, it had been requested by Columbia Records. And it was a very interesting time. There was one other thing I must mention that happened to me in the 1950s, because this man became a very great friend. I had a phone call about 1955 from a man who said his name was Herbie Spencer, and he was in London to supervise the recording of a score for a musical film called Gentlemen Marry Brunettes with Jane Russell and Jeannie Crane. And Herbie asked me if I would come to his apartment and work on one of the numbers for the show, for the film. And so I went along there. I discovered Bob Farnham was already there, and the three of us wrote the set one arrangement by passing pages. I wrote all the band stuff. Bob Farnham seemed to write all the backing vocal stuff, and Herbie wrote all the orchestral stuff. And we were each in a separate room. Herbie had the only piano. So, so we did that, and we became friends from that. We were friends from then on until the day that Herbie died. And that friendship meant a great deal to me. So now, at the end of the 50s, one thing I did was to give up doing the movies, because they were rather disappointing, apart from one which I worked on called Let's Be Happy, which Al Sendri also worked on, although we didn't meet. It was a film with Tony Martin and Vera Ellen, and Al came over to score all her dance numbers, which he did in such a wonderful manner. And we didn't actually meet, though, until many, many years later. So I gave up. When I got into the 1960s, I gave up doing movies. The equipment was so bad, the microphones were all so fashioned, it sounded awful. And reverb, they'd never heard of reverb. And if they had a shot where a man was running down through a tunnel or something, they would probably find reverb from somewhere. But for music, no, of course not. So I now go into the 60s, and I spent throughout the 60s, I did a lot of recording for Reader's Digest Records. And the producer was a man called Charles Gerhardt, who used to come over to supervise these recordings, and the money that they lavished on them was just incredible. I mean, I remember doing projects, and they say, you can have the Royal Philharmonic, you know. And, this is after being at Philips all those years, where they'd be giving me 2 violas, 2 celli, and 8 violins, you know. And so this was great, and they were always done in most wonderful halls. There's one in London called, well, there were 2. There was one in Holborn called, what was that called? Kingsway Hall, had a fantastic acoustic. Then there's another, Walthamstow Civic Hall, which has the most wonderful acoustic. So it was a great joy to do this work. And I made another very important friend at the beginning of the 60s, Norman Luboff, who many of you will remember from the Norman Luboff Choir. He came to London with his family to live for about 4 years, and they became our neighbours. And very, very great friends. I mean, to the point that we would rent together, sharing the costs of vacation villas and things like that. And of course, Norman and I worked on a number of projects. And they were always a pleasure. He wrote for the choir, I wrote for the orchestra. One day he said, we have to do a project with Leopold Stokowski. So I thought, gosh, I felt a bit intimidated by that. But we wrote these arrangements, and they were all kind of inspirational tunes like Deep River and Sheep May Safely Graze and all that kind of thing. And one day he said, we have to take the scores to Stokowski, to his hotel, on Saturday afternoon. So we did this. We went to the De Vere Hotel in Kensington. We were told to go up to the room. We found him resting. He'd been rehearsing Carmina Burana all morning at the Albert Hall, and he was going to do a performance that evening. So he took the scores, and he thanked us, and he said he would study them the following day, Sunday, because we were going to record Monday and Tuesday. And then he said, how many tracks will we be recording on? Well, we knew that Wilkie, or Kenneth Wilkinson was his full name, for Decca Records, always recorded 2-track stereo. And we said 2 tracks. He said, oh no, I can't record. He said, I must have 4 tracks or 6 tracks. Otherwise, when I get back to New York, how am I going to mix it, you see? So he said, no, I can't record. So we went to my apartment, which was the nearest, and we got out the London telephone directory, and we started trying to, of course, we discovered the Decca was closed. We tried to find Kenneth Wilkinson. And of course, if you can imagine how many Kenneth Wilkinsons there are in London. After phoning about 12, Norman opened a bottle of red wine. And from then on, it was less and less important. Find Kenneth Wilkinson. And we just gave up. Now, on the Monday morning, we all had to meet at the De Vere Hotel to ride out in the limo to the Walthamstow Civic Hall. It was a ride of about an hour. So we got in the car with Stokowski. Stokowski and Norman sat on the back seat, and Chuck Gerhardt and I sat facing them. Somewhere during the trip out to Walthamstow, Chuck Gerhardt said, Mr. Stokowski, he said, contractually speaking, are you free at the present time? And Stokowski thought for a minute. He said, yes. He said, I'm totally free for music and for sex. So then we got to Walthamstow Town Hall and we went straight to the control room. I thought, now there's going to be trouble about the tracks, you see. And he said to Kenneth Wilkinson, who was there, how many tracks are we recording on today? And he said 2. He said, that'll be fine. So now we start to do the first session. Now the first piece is called "The Heavens Are Telling," a Beethoven song, which we'd scored for orchestra and choir. And he did a take, and then we all went to the control room, and he said, "Now then, somebody get a piece of paper and a pencil and write down what I say." So all he said was "more sopranos." So we went back and did another take. And then we went back in the control room, and I think you can probably guess the rest. More altos. And then another take, more tenors, and another take, more basses. Now, what a waste of time. No, Norman was furious. He was red with rage that Stokowski wouldn't defer to him. And he'd wasted 4 takes just having the choir sing louder. And then he picked a quarrel with 2 violinists and said either they left the hall or he would. And then he said to the choir, he said, I want to hear more of the letter K in the word creatures. And then, you know, in England, when they have a 10 or a break, you know, there are ladies who make tea. And he pinched the bottom of one of these ladies and chased her. And then we had to ride back to London at the end of the day in the limo. Well, Norman sat with the driver. He wouldn't sit in the back. Chuck Gerhardt had spotted a photographer friend who he went home with. So I rode back with Stokowski in the back seat of the car with nothing much to talk about. What am I going to talk about, Stokowski? And he managed to talk for an hour about a wonderful French horn player he'd found in Moscow called Shapiro. So that was the end of that story. So that was the beginning of the 1960s. I got into that. I realised I'd been too rash in giving up movie scoring, and from then on I tried very, very hard to get back into it, and finally managed in 1969 to start getting movies again. And in that year I did a couple. I did one in March, I did one in June, and then later in the year Benny Goodman came to town, and he said he wanted to make an album, and he wanted to do a European tour with a British band. So I was asked to write some arrangements for this album. And I started having meetings with him at Philips Records. And I discovered that there were some difficulties about getting along with this man. As much as he was my hero, I mean, from my clarinet playing days, my goodness me, Benny Goodman, you know, he couldn't make up his mind. I mean, we would sit for hours waiting for him to decide what tune I should arrange. And the A&R man at Philips, a man called Johnny Franz, had been out to restaurants with Benny, and he said it's a nightmare. He said because he orders his food and then he keeps changing his mind, drives the waiters crazy. So I sat for hours, and finally he did give me some tunes to do, and we had a recording session, and they recorded 3 of my arrangements, which he was very generously said he liked. And then there was to be another recording, and he gave me one number which was on a clear day, so okay, that's okay. Now he wanted me to do another one, and we sat for hours, and finally I went home about 10:30 at night. He thought of a tune, and as I walked in my apartment, the phone was ringing. It was Benny. I don't like that tune. Why don't you do so and so? You see, so now I wrote an arrangement of so and so, and we get to the recording, and he records on a clear day. And then he calls out this one, you know, and about 12 bars into it, he said, I love what you're doing with it. He said, but I don't like that tune after all. So I thought, well, that's the end, because I don't know about all of you, but if I write arrangements, there are two things that are my minimum requirements. One is to get paid, and the other one, if I'm there to hear it through from the beginning to the end, it was just one time. And Benny didn't seem willing to be that generous. So that was the end of Benny, but he did call many, many times in the years after that to ask me if I would do something. And finally, a long time later, 10 years later, he was in London, and would I go and have a drink? So I went and had a drink with him, and he said, it must have been 1977, because he said that the following year he was going to do an anniversary concert at Carnegie Hall, which will be an anniversary of the famous concert in Carnegie Hall, where they played Sing Sing Sing, that famous concert. And he said, wouldn't I do something for that? And I said, okay, I've got an idea for doing an arrangement of I'm Beginning to See the Light. So I said, okay, I'll do that. So Benny goes back to New York. I then immediately get pulled into doing a film that some of the composers had a nervous breakdown or something. Will I take over this film? It was an animated feature called Watership Down. And immediately I'm into this thing, and I'm writing music in every minute that I can find. And of course it was impossible to write this arrangement of Beginning to See the Light. So I wrote a letter to Benny explaining, and I never heard from him again. I think he'd had enough of me. But so I finally did get back into movie scoring. And in the 1970s, I did some nice films. Very early on, Herbie Spencer turned up again. He was going to work on a film called Jesus Christ Superstar. And apparently Andrew Lloyd Webber and his friends had recorded all the tracks, and they'd gone to Israel to shoot. And then when they came back, they had a lot of problems with these tracks, with sync and all kinds of things. And Norman Jewison, the director, asked Andre Previn to take a look at this film and to say what had to be done and make a list of things that had to be done. Andre did that, and then he called Herbie, and then Herbie called me. And so we worked on this film together, and that was always a joy to be doing anything with Herbie. And then I worked on a film called The Little Prince. This was a musical version of that French story. The songs had been written by Lerner and Lowe, and I did the adaptation, and I was lucky enough to be nominated along with them for an Academy Award. And I came for the ceremonies and had a most wonderful time. Then I went back and I did another musical called The Slipper and the Rose, which was an English musical based on the Cinderella story, except that Richard Chamberlain came and played the leading part. And I did the adaptation, the conducting, everything. And I was lucky enough to be nominated with the Sherman Brothers, again, an Academy Award. Now, those visits to California made a big impression on me. I became absolutely seduced by the way of life in Southern California. And after I did Watership Down, I could only think of one thing now, to come and live here. And England at that time was going through a bad patch. We had strikes all the time, and we'd be sitting with candles for a light, because the electricity had gone off. They were striking in the power station, so we'd be freezing cold, be wearing overcoats in the house at 8 in the evening with candles, and then when that finished there'd be a transport strike, and it just seemed unbearable. So Chris and I came, and we rented an apartment in Brentwood, and I set about trying to get a green card. And I got permission to work, stamped in my passport. And I went to Warner Brothers and I started doing episodes of TV. And then a few months later I did a TV movie for them. And then very gradually we actually moved here, bought a house here, and started working. I did a lot of work. In the very beginning I did a lot of jobs for Ian, of course. And kind friends gave me things to do. And I got started. And then I did lots of episodes of all those soap operas like Dynasty and Dallas and Hotel and Falcon Crest. And a lot of shows that only were ever on for one season and you never saw them again. And then in the early summer, I'd find myself doing arrangements for John Williams for the Pops. And Ian would call me occasionally and I'd do something for him, for Julie. And Mel Torme. I made an album with Mel Torme in the 50s. That was a very memorable thing, and we became sort of friends from then on. I did lots of things with him. In the 60s I did some TV specials, writing the arrangements and conducting for TV, And also Rosemary Clooney came into town, and we did some recording, and I made an album with Marlene Dietrich. That was in the middle 50s. So now, I do the Pops and Julie and Mel, and that would be absolutely fine. And then all those things went off the air one by one, and I was only left then with doing some things for John, for the Pops, and occasionally things for films, because from way back in the 70s, John, or rather Herbie, had called me, could I come and help with the orchestration of Star Wars? So I did some cues for Star Wars and for Superman and for The Empire Strikes Back. And then after I came to live here, I could occasionally did things for John's films like Hook and E.T. and Schindler's List, Home Alone 1 and 2. And then we had the earthquake in '94, which everybody will remember. We had very, very little damage, but it scared the pants off me. And I decided I can't live in a place where that might happen in the middle of the night. And so we started thinking about living somewhere else. And we thought we'd go and have a look at Scottsdale. We'd heard some nice things about Scottsdale in Arizona. So we went to have a look, and we were shown some houses, and we just decided this was a wonderful place to live. So we sold our house here in 5 days, and bought a nice house in Scottsdale, and that's where we are. And I still do things for John, for his CDs, and the last two have been especially delightful because they've been with Itzhak Perlman, and writing solos for Stuart Kanin was always a great pleasure, but to write them for Itzhak Perlman is a thing on its own. So, and that's just about where we are right now, and all I can do is thank you very, very much for listening to this boring tale.
Thanks, Angela. That was wonderful. Did anybody have any questions for Angela? I don't know. Any questions?
I asked her about the contractor. Did he get the job?
Oh, I'll tell you.
It was Johnny Friends.
The contractor was a man called Harry Benson. Actually.
Oh, Harry Benson. Oh, he was awful.
And he would turn out to be not a bad contractor. He turned out to be not a bad contractor. Once I persuaded him not to play the bass, and I did this by saying, Harry, this thing is a jazz thing that we have next Thursday. I said, I'd like to find somebody for me who really plays a lot of jazz. You see, so he said, okay, I'll do that. And then the next thing, well, this thing is a very classical, Harry. I'm thinking of one thing. It was something from Tosca that I was doing with a tenor. I said, this, somebody who does a lot of symphony work. Oh, okay. And gradually, everything seemed to be jazz or symphony, So, anything else? No. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Angela. It was wonderful. I have one question for one of our members here. He's looking for a song. I Love California. Does anybody know it or have a lead sheet? I Love You, California. George? Nobody has it? Yeah? Well, they have it at the store. Okay, it's the gentleman behind you. Okay, we found that. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Next month, book early. Jimmy Haskell and Sandy Courage. Hold on, I think Cher is approaching with something. We're all done?
They've just discovered personal abuse. And an X-ray, and he didn't write it. All he wrote was a prologue on 2 hours, and the main title on 2 stages, and he wanted me now to orchestrate this. So we did that, and I was asked to take over the movie.
Oh my God. remembering nine people in the room. Teddy Joyce Juvenile Band. No, all three of us, nine of us in the room. Remember that? That was very interesting.